Life is a journey, best shared with epic people. We're sharing stories of great adventure, whether it's the physical odyssey of climbing Mount Everest, scaling a business, overcoming personal adversity, or designing your dream life. Hop on board as we strive to better ourselves, each other, and our communities. I'm your host, Ryan Munsey, and this is the Better Human Project.
The bottom line is we really need to rethink our expectations of having an individually owned car, all of those kinds of things. It's an incredible privilege to have a privately owned vehicle. It's an incredible privilege to have public transportation. Brits annually drive 252.5 billion miles. Okay? If they drove those miles with electric vehicles, that would increase annually UK generated electricity by 20%.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Better Human Project. This week, we are rejoined by Katie Singer, and if you didn't catch Katie's previous appearance, it is episode number 83, and it will be linked in the show notes for you to easily navigate your way to that episode. On that episode, Katie talked about internet consumption and emissions, everything that goes into the internet, and 5G. What we really started to dive into there was something that we're going to call true cost accounting. And this is going to show up again. This is really kind of the underlying or the governing dynamics of most of these conversations with Katie, where we tend as humans and as a society to look at the usable portion of these things, whether it's internet, renewables, electric vehicles. Today, we're talking about electric vehicles. And, as Katie presents in all of her papers, her argument is that we should look at the entire lifespan from cradle to usage to grave, and cradle being research and development portion. So if you buy a new laptop, the moment you turn it on, that is the usage portion. If you buy a new electric vehicle, that is the usage portion. There's an entire cradle portion that we don't see, that we ignore, that we don't think about, that we don't bring into the carbon equation, if you will. So you hear all these companies talking about trying to be carbon neutral, or that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2025 or whatever that might be. The things that they are omitting from those equations are the things that Katie is bringing to light, and those are the things that we're talking about in this conversation. So if you take nothing from these conversations, I want you to take the true cost accounting philosophy and apply that to absolutely everything, every element of life. There are costs beyond what we normally see. If you go to the grocery store and you buy meat, there's a cost other than the $4.99 a pound you pay for whatever you're buying. And in some cases, that's built into it. In other cases, those true costs are certainly not made up. And that's what we're going to get into today when we talk about electric vehicles. The statistics and some of the anecdotes, or not anecdotes, but some of the data is incredibly alarming. And I've highlighted some of the things from Katie and her colleague Gary's recent paper on electric vehicles. Some of those statistics are going to be in the show notes, just for you to easily find. The entire paper is linked in the show notes as well. I highly recommend reading that. I think just the other thing I'll say, and this is kind of in the description of the episode, in our idyllic utopian visions, we imagine a world where every single person is driving an electric vehicle, battery powered or renewable or something like that. And in order to have that as a utopic vision, that requires us to be blind to what it actually takes to get there, or to not understand, to not ask the questions. And that's what Katie has done. That's what we're bringing up today in the podcast. As she points out, this myopic view has a potentially fatal flaw. And it's because we're only focused on how we fuel our vehicles, and that's that usable portion of their lifespan. Again, it's ignoring what it takes to produce them, create them, mine all the things that go into them. And as usual, we're concerned with ourselves and our day-to-day lives and maintaining our modern conveniences. If we don't have to investigate or interrogate what it takes to facilitate our ability to, live normal lives of convenience, then we're not going to. And it's that narrow focus that has created these blind spots to the true cost of what is required to produce these modern vehicles. And that's what our discussion is going to be today. So without further ado, here is Katie and our conversation on whether or not electric vehicles are as great for planet Earth as we think they are. Katie Singer, welcome back to the Better Human Project.
I am so glad to be here.
I'm excited for this conversation. So if anybody listening hasn't listened to the previous episode with you, I'm actually drawing a blank on what number it is right now. Maybe 83, whatever it is, we'll put a link to it in the show notes, so it's one click away for you. But in that episode, we talked about the internet's true cost, usage, 5G, all kinds of things that we need to investigate and look into with our consumption and usage. And we're going to continue that conversation today, but with electric vehicles and renewables. And Katie and a colleague, I should have written this.
Let me come in here. If we can focus just on electric vehicles.
Sure.
And then, because the renewables are, they're enormous. And yeah,
okay. So that can be a third podcast if we want to do that. So today we'll talk electric vehicles. You've got a paper that is it out now, or is it coming out soon?
We hope it will come out soon. We are very close to the finish line.
Okay, so your co-author in that is Gary Olheft.
Yes.
PhD professor emeritus in geophysics at the Colorado School of Mines. He's a life member of IEEE and a DBS patient. We'll have to get you to explain what those stand for. If you can explain that, and then we'll jump in.
Sure. That's actually an interesting place to start. So Gary Olheft and I have been in conversation for almost 10 years. He has 2 degrees in electrical engineering from MIT and a PhD in geophysics. He, during his career, did things like at EPA, he developed an AI program where you could take toxic sludge from a Superfund site, put it into his program, and it would identify the toxins in your sample and give you directions on how to clean it up.
Wow.
He worked for U.S. Geological Survey doing things with planets. I mean, he worked at NASA when he was still an undergraduate at MIT. And for the last 20 years, he taught at the Colorado School of Mines. IEEE, which stands for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. Yes, he is a life member of IEEE. And then you said he's a DBS patient. What that means is he has a deep brain stimulator implanted in his brain because he has Parkinson's. And this medical implant, which is an electronic device with a battery, it reduces the need for him to take medications. Okay. And he was getting side effects from the medications for Parkinson's.
Right. And we may
So-
be jumping ahead. I know this is something that's actually
Yeah.
in your paper because I read this, that he was having some issues with the electromagnetic field in electronic vehicles negatively interfering with that DBS implant.
With his implant,
Yeah.
right. And so we can get to that.
Okay.
But but it's relevant to hear his credentials because
Yeah, they're
know,
impressive.
the dude knows what he's talking about when it comes to electronics and electronic interference and geophysics. And I've just learned a lot from him. I will say I'm the kindergartner in the conversation, and that is a highly respected position. I ask him really dumb questions, and sometimes he'll say to me, "Did you go to college?" Because my questions are so simple. But then at the same time, we're really teaching each other a lot because I will notice these things that seem so obvious from my kindergarten perspective, and I'm really wanting to share some of those. And then he starts going with great depth into responses to these questions in ways that I think it's fresh for him to think about the situation. So, yes, this paper comes out of our conversation.
Okay. Well, you mentioned before we hit record that you had a couple of places you might want to start. So before I start rattling off some of the questions that I have for you after reading one of the first drafts of the paper, where would you like to start with this?
I'm thinking that so we're basically pointing out a lot of things that are not included in evaluations of the energy use and rare earths extracted, worker hazards, all those kinds of things. We're really looking at what is not included in those evaluations. Mm-hmm. And these are hard pills to swallow. What I want to say, though, is that I think every one of us is aware that we can't continue this level of consumption of energy and rare earths, and we want to do our part to reduce our consumption. And so a lot of people have bought hybrids and now electric vehicles in order to do their part to reduce their consumption, to reduce their footprint when it comes to transportation. I want to salute everyone for their efforts, and I really want to ask, once we become aware of what we are not including in our evaluations of, specifically here, electric vehicles, once we become aware of that, now we've got a choice. And how do we move forward with that awareness? So that's really the question which I want to put to people who are listening to the conversation. What do we do once we're aware of the fuller picture?
You're speaking my language. This is, one of the phrases that's in my book, and one of the things I find myself saying over and over and over again is awareness creates choice. And I guess before we get to the choice part of this conversation, maybe let's start with you bringing some more awareness to our current situation. I think the way that I had kind of written this down and framed it after looking at what you guys are presenting, and kind of what I said in the introduction here is that we have this, you kind of alluded to it right there, we have this tendency to look at only the cost of transporting ourselves as we go about our daily lives. And it's a very narrow view of the true cost of an automobile. And I kind of borrowed from our previous conversation where, you have the cradle to grave kind of accounting model, if you will, of what the true cost is. And so, the cradle being research and development and production, and then the lifespan is the usage, and that's typically the only thing that we focus on, right? Is what's the energy cost
The
of
operating,
exactly
the operation of it.
right. And then the grave is how do we dispose of these things. And so you guys have really shed some light on the beginning and the end outside of that operation. But then there are also some things, within the operation that we haven't considered. So, I mean, that's where I had kind of planned to take this conversation. So, do you want to maybe start with some of the questions I have around that, and then, anything we don't get to that you wanted to cover, we can come back to, or is that?
That sounds good. Let me
Okay.
lay out these things that I've learned, and
Yeah.
and then you come in when I love having other kindergartners in the room with me, and I love hearing what your questions are
Okay.
around this, and it's great if I don't know the answers, and I often don't, because we need the questions in order to get to the awareness that you're talking about, so we can make actual choices. So if you go to fueleconomy.gov, you'll see labels for different kinds of vehicles, and they'll say how much energy is this vehicle using when it's operating. And with an electric vehicle, there's a flashy zero emissions, zero fuel use during operation. This kind of makes me crazy because it, as you said, it excludes the energy and mining, all the stuff required to design the vehicle, and that is actually really intense. You need these 3D printers and computer modeling and robotics just to design the vehicle. Then we go from there to extraction. And as I explained in the last conversation, one smartphone can have more than 1,000 substances in it. It does have more than 1,000 substances. Each substance has its own international supply chain. So in a vehicle, in an electric vehicle, you can have between 50 and 100 different computers. Now, they're each going to have a lot of substances in them to operate the functions that we want the car to provide. But there's more than computers in the car. We've got headlights, we've got glass and mirrors, we've got batteries, we've got sensors. There are lots of motors in the vehicle. There's so much. There are catalytic converters. All of those things, each of those things, the tires, each thing needs ingredients that will be mined or manufactured, solvents, all of those things. And then there's shipping, cargo shipping of the different substances. If cargo shipping was a country, it would rank 6th in greenhouse gas emissions on planet Earth. That's pretty intense. and so if we're moving in a direction of saying, hey, we want to decrease our dependence on international supply chains, and we want to strengthen local supply chains, that's a really noble goal. And how are we going to do that as long as we have vehicles that are dependent on international supply chains, as long as we have computers that depend on international supply chains. So you start to see some of what goes into the cradle, let's say the cradle to the point of sale, the energy and extraction, and I haven't talked about worker hazards, but all of that stuff that goes into designing, mining, smelting, transporting, manufacturing, assembling, all of that stuff that happens before the point of sale. None of that energy is included in the label at fueleconomy.gov. I was driving around town yesterday in my 24-year-old car. Still, it's a car. It got manufactured. And I saw somebody proudly driving around this vehicle with 0 emissions painted along the side of it. And I was thinking, wow, this person does not know what happened before buying that vehicle. That's amazing to me.
Yeah, and so that's going to be one of the questions that I was going to ask you later in the episode, but I mean, since you brought it up, I'll ask it now. I mean, once we finish this conversation and, we have a full awareness of the embodied energy and the true cost of manufacturing an electric vehicle, is the net energy and net cost actually better for the environment, for us to buy that? Or should we, continue to drive older vehicles that maybe don't necessarily get the best gas mileage, but don't require us to consume more minerals and resources and human cost and all that to, put a new vehicle on the road?
Okay, so that is a really key question. I'm going to rephrase it, I'm going to repeat it, and then I'm going to say the question that I'm now looking at.
Okay.
You're saying, okay, Katie Singer, you just announced yourself as driving a 24-year-old vehicle. Is it better to keep an older vehicle on the road longer, keep it repaired and driving as long as possible, or is it better to buy a new electric vehicle that will not consume any gasoline during its operation? Is that basically what you're asking?
Yes, but I mean, this is why I was going to ask this question later, because we're skipping a lot of stuff to get to that point, right? I mean, we talked about.
We'll get back to the other stuff. But,
Okay. So yes, essentially that's the question.
Tell me if that's your question.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So number one, at this point, the answer that I get from the engineers I talk with is that it's better to drive an older vehicle longer and keep it guzzling tons of gas longer it's better to do that than to buy a new vehicle.
Wow.
And what I'd like to do is explain why that's true, so we can go into some of the details that we outline for what goes into every new vehicle.
Okay.
And then specifically what goes into new electric vehicles.
Yep.
Let me also say the question that I'm now with is, what will reduce our overall consumption? So instead of saying, hey, this is an energy efficient electric vehicle, we need to ask, what reduces our consumption overall?
Right.
And that's actually a new question.
Right.
So let me break it down. So number one, let's look at the Jevons paradox, Jevons. We talked about this a little in our last conversation.
Mm-hmm.
William Jevons was a British economist, and in 1865 he wrote a book called The Coal Question. At that time, manufacturers were doing mass production of cast iron pots and denim blue jeans, sewing machines, and they were transporting these on trains powered by coal going at the unheard of speed of, I think, 20 miles an hour. And they were transporting these things all over Europe, Western Europe, and this was incredible energy efficiency. So people didn't have to make their own pots anymore. They didn't have to make their own blue jeans anymore, or their own pants. It was mass production and mass distribution. What Jevons figured out is that energy efficiency actually increases consumption of raw materials and consumption of energy. Whenever you mass produce anything, you need to mine the ores, you need to smelt them, you need a lot more coal to transport them. I mean, in those years, that was how the trains were powered. Mm-hmm. But you see that as you mass produce something and the price gets lower, more people buy the product. You're mass producing something, you're going to be mass extracting and mass consuming of energy. That is also true for electric vehicles. So if we look at the overall consumption, that's a better window, a more constructive window, a more realistic window than comparing it to,
So
a gas guzzler.
right. So is the reason that the conversation doesn't focus on what you just mentioned, the overall consumption, is it because of the financial aspect and the huge economy around the perception of being green? And I know this kind of gets into, what we had talked about previously with like Planet of the Humans and, how much people stand to gain financially from some of these things that are perceived as people doing their part.
That's obviously a factor. I'm also really aware of, I'm thinking of this story. If you're living in a house and you have, and your spouse goes away for the day, and then your neighbor has these barking dogs, and they bark all day long. And then your spouse gets home, and there's no barking. Your spouse doesn't hear the barking, and you're crazy. You're crazy by the end of that day.
Right.
And your spouse comes home and says, "What is your problem?" And you say, "I've just been listening to barking dogs all day long." And it's just not going to make sense to somebody who hasn't heard the dogs. It's the same thing with our cars, with all of these products. What is invisible to us is invisible to us. So if we don't see the mining for neodymium, the mining for gold, the mining for yttrium, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the coltan, the cobalt, the copper, the cerium, if we don't see that mining, the worker hazards, there are children who are buried alive mining for cobalt, which is necessary for the batteries in electric vehicles. If we don't hear about it, we don't see it, we don't hear about it. And manufacturers are not going around promoting what happens
Right.
in those processes.
Right.
I've actually been looking for photographs so that I could have an illustration or a series of photos that would illustrate what really goes into every vehicle. And it's really hard to find these pictures, even if you're going to pay money for them. I don't, I mean, I can imagine a lot of reasons why that is, but it's just really hard to do. So part of it is that we consumers don't know it's happening. Manufacturers have kept it quiet. We do have some federal legislation in the United States, the Dodd-Frank Act. When was that passed? I think I've got it in the paper. It's about, I'm guessing it's about 10 years old. And yes, 2010. And it requires publicly listed corporations to check their supply chains for tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. These are all commonly used in computers. They're called conflict minerals. A conflict mineral is an ore that is mined under human abuse or other kinds of conflict. That's a simple definition. Mm-hmm. So the Dodd-Frank Act required manufacturers to report these to the Securities and Exchange Commission and to report their efforts in locating the mineral source, because manufacturers will buy these conflict minerals for use in their vehicles and computers and other things. They need to report the supply chain, because then if we can trace the supply chain, there's a better chance that there will be worker protections involved. Okay, in 2017, under the Trump administration, the SEC suspended enforcement of this regulation. So, in other words, you've still got, if you're a manufacturer, you've still got to report your efforts in finding the supply chain involved for these 4 ingredients, but they're not going to enforce.
Like you still have
They're
to,
not gonna
like they're
enforce
saying,
anything.
they're saying you still have to turn this paperwork in. We're just not going to read it or look at it.
Exactly. Now, in Europe, they have a regulation that will take effect this January 2021, and it will apply to mineral importers, which is different from end product manufacturers. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that will be more constructive or what. That's certainly the aim there. So in terms of the question, why don't we know about this? Well, 1, it's invisible to us. 2, the regulations that we've got around it are very minimal, and they've just gotten, there's no enforcement of it in this country. And that's only for 4 ingredients. There are probably, if there are 1,000 ingredients in a smartphone, I would guess there are at least that many in an electric vehicle. So, and then I'll say, it is not easy to swallow this information. And we've not been looking at these kinds of questions. Like, okay, what are the real emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions involved? What's really happening in the toxic waste emissions in terms of manufacturing this thing? We don't look at those questions. We're looking at how cool this electric vehicle is. It's much easier to look at that than to look at the supply chain.
Right. And to your point, I mean, we've kind of been conditioned to just only think about the cost that we think of or see in the usage portion of the lifespan. And before we get into that, because there are some things we need to talk about there as well. But before we get into that, I want to highlight some of the things in your paper, and we'll have a link in the show notes to the paper, because I think everybody that listens to this should go read the paper and see everything that's in it. But you highlighted that you mentioned the mineral coltan, which I'd never heard of. Mining for coltan has led to more murders than any other single event since World War II. I mean, that's an incredible statement, and this is something. I mean, I think if you asked, like I said, I didn't know what coltan was. Most people don't. Most people don't know it's in a vehicle. Like, much less, do we? If we don't even know about something like that, then we don't know to ask the question. Well, where is it coming from, and how is it being produced, and what is the human cost of that? What are the conditions of the workers?
Did you look it up after you read that? Were you able to do that?
I didn't go that far down the rabbit hole.
So let me say a little about coltan. Coltan is short for columbite tantalite. And when it is refined to a powder, it will hold charge. So it's used in mobile devices, in batteries. There are lots of things in batteries. If we're sticking with electric vehicles, there's also cobalt, and there's a lawsuit that came about nearly a year ago with some UK lawyers who are defending parents some of whose children were buried alive while mining for cobalt. And people do know that cobalt they tend to know about cobalt in electric vehicle batteries. These children are paid maybe $2 a day for their labor. There's also graphite, which is also involved in batteries. And when mining for graphite, it's like the stuff in our lead pencils, the particulates will get everywhere. They'll just flood the air. They'll get on clothes. They'll get in your lungs. They'll get on livestock. They'll get on plants. It's really hazardous for anyone and ecosystems near the mining. There's neodymium, which is an intense magnet. That's common in lots of the engine, the headlight. I don't know. There's the motors. There are lots of applications of neodymium, and if you look, it's commonly mined in Baotao, China. That's something I've been looking for pictures of, and I can't find it. Although I've found some descriptions. There was something that was really strong. The Natural History Museum in United Kingdom, their scientists did research on this. This was really strong for me. They explained that replacing all UK-based vehicles with electric vehicles would take almost 208 tons of cobalt.
208,000.
208,000, thank you.
Yep. I pulled this quote out. I'm staring at it. Yeah. It got me too. 264,000 tons of lithium carbonate, at least 7,200 tons of neodymium and dysprosium. Dysprosium is also a magnet, and more than 2 million tons of copper. I mean, that's not going to help us. Right. And so that's where my question that I asked you earlier that I said I was really going to ask later about, what is the better choice? Should we be buying new cars that, sure, while we drive them, use less energy, but require all of, these resources and the production that we're now shining a light on that, isn't good for the ecosystem or the humans involved. And, like this is, I think in our like utopian, idyllic vision of the future, we think of, everybody, oh, wouldn't it be great if everybody could drive an electric vehicle? And then you read this study where somebody actually went through and said, okay, well, what would it take for that to happen? And you hear what the raw material cost would be. And then now we start to shine light on every one of those components and what goes into that. You mentioned 203 or 2.3 million tons of copper. And then later in the paper, you guys highlight that a U.S. Geological Survey found that for every kilogram of copper mined, at least 21 kilograms of waste is generated.
Right.
So when you look at the true cost and the embodied energy of this stuff, it's not a net positive. It's not carbon neutral. You hear all this stuff about, oh, we're going to be a carbon neutral company, by 2025. Well, not if you're producing stuff like this.
Not if you're including this in your calculations.
Right. And you can't have, if these are your products, you can't honestly have a calculation that doesn't include these things.
Okay, I want to hold I love your passion in this moment. I want to hold it and read another quote from these scientists in UK. They figured out that, so Tesla calls it supercharging stations free, right?
Yep. And this is another thing I was going to ask you about. This is what I'm talking about when mentioning when I say within the lifespan, that we have to highlight as well. So yeah, go for it.
Now, all of those charging stations also have to be manufactured, and I don't have the details on what goes into each charging station, but it's going to require mining. We know that. Right. And cargo shipping between stations and stuff like that.
Metals and wires and most likely copper and insulation for the wiring. Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
And then it also requires a fuel source for charging up. Like it's going to need some kind of electricity.
Yes, and that's the one I wanted to talk about is, we think, oh, well, I'm driving this electric vehicle. It plugs in and doesn't require any gasoline. Cool. Well, what are you plugging it into?
Right.
You're plugging into the grid, and what powers the grid? The grid's not solar.
Yeah, well, in solar, that's our next conversation about what goes into manufacturing solar.
Yeah.
So the hardware to run a solar system. Okay, so what the scientists from the Natural History Museum in UK figured out is that charging electric vehicles, so Brits annually drive 252.5 billion miles. Okay? Mm-hmm. If they drove those miles with electric vehicles, that would increase annually UK generated electricity by 20%.
And so that would be a fossil fuel requirement to fulfill that, most likely, right?
As far as I can tell, even if you were able to generate solar power, which would probably be hard in UK, or wind power, you have to manufacture the hardware for all of that stuff, and that takes a tremendous amount of extraction and fossil fuels to manufacture the hardware. So there's no such thing as carbon-free, zero emissions, green, clean. It's not that these are really misleading terms, and I mean, we could use stronger words and say they're wrong.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think this is where somebody or some bodies are shaping the conversation and intentionally shaping the way that the public thinks about these things. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's tons of financial benefit, from that. We want to believe this because we want to be able to just buy a cool, fancy new car that looks cool and, is a status symbol and is also electrical and, an electric vehicle. And we can say, hey, I'm doing my part. But, deep, or, as we're starting to see, like the government, the corporations, everybody that's involved in this is well aware of the true cost. I mean, you're highlighting tons of studies. Countries around the world are doing these studies. I mean, the ones you just mentioned. The thing I have to keep reminding myself when I read those is, that's the UK, right? Like I have a tendency to think that's Europe. Like it's not all of Europe. That's just Britain, right? Those numbers are just in the UK, not all of Europe. And when we look at one of these other stats that you shared, so 2016, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation issued Globe Metallurgical Incorporated. They're a silicone manufacturer, right? So as we go back to that conversation a minute ago where, every component that goes into, or every ingredient, as you call them, for phones and cars, whatever, this is just a silicone manufacturer. Just in the state.
And that would be for the transistors in the computers,
right,
in the vehicle.
Okay, so like we're not talking about something that is large, right? Like it's not the amount of steel or metal that makes up the body, right? And this is just the state of New York that has issued them a permit to release the following contaminants every single year: 250 tons of carbon monoxide, 10 tons of formaldehyde, 10 tons of hydrogen chloride, 10 tons of lead, 75,000 tons of oxides of nitrogen, 75,000 tons of particulates, 10 tons of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, 40 tons of sulfur dioxide, and 7 tons of sulfuric acid mist. That's a lot of stuff just for silicone.
Well, that's the legal amount allowed annually
in New York
State
by one company,
one manufacturer. Now, let me clarify, because you're saying the transistors are not large. However, since starting in 2013, we manufactured more transistors than farmers grew grains of wheat or rice. Now, we manufacture 1,000 times more transistors than farmers grow grains of wheat and rice combined. So one iWatch can have 1 billion transistors in it. Now, they're tiny. They can be the size of dust, I think.
Well, they'd have to be to get 1 billion of them in a watch.
Yeah. The thing is that this is just such a highly refined, toxic greenhouse gas emitting process. And all of these products in our daily lives now depend on manufacturing this stuff. It's invisible to us. We are not aware of what really goes in. And that's just, Globe Metallurgical is only doing one step in the process of manufacturing usable transistors.
Right.
There are other steps that are also energy intensive and greenhouse gas emitting.
Right. And I'm sure if you looked into this, if maybe you guys did this in the paper, maybe not, I don't know. But I mean, I'm sure if somebody really wanted to, you could look into not only you have two parties involved in this agreement, right? New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So you could look into every other company that they issued similar permits to, right? So what are they allowing all the companies to, release into the New York area? And then also look at Globe Metallurgical and say, well, how many states are they operating in, and how many different places are they allowed to, maybe they're operating in 5 different states and they're dumping that much stuff into 5 different states. And maybe every state is allowing, 10, 20, 50 different companies like this to dump stuff.
Well, and then we'd have to look at China, where the regulations are much less strict and they're manufacturing a tremendous amount of silicon wafers for solar panels, and it's the same process. So there's, yeah, you're starting to ask the questions, and it's coming because this stuff is becoming visible to you.
Right.
So now I want to ask you a question, Ryan. You're starting to see, wait a second, this electric vehicle that I've lusted for or whatever, it's not really zero emissions. It's not green, it's not clean, it's not toxic free, it's not greenhouse gas emitting free. Now what? How do we, what do we do from here? Is there a way that, one, we can introduce this to the larger public so that people can hear it, and then we're going to have to give them something that will be desirable. Like,
Right.
we're going to have to give them this information in small steps,
Yeah.
and then we're going to have to say, okay, here's what here's some options we see.
Right, right, and that's where, my background is in nutrition, right? So I'm very used to people saying, oh, well, for the last 20 years, I heard, fat was bad, and that I needed to eat whole grains, and so now you're telling me that what I used to think was healthy is not healthy, and people just kind of throw their hands up and they're like, all right, well, what now? What am I supposed to do, right? And everywhere I look, I get conflicting information. So, and that's kind of why I posed the question to you of, is it actually better, to go buy these, new electric cars? And you answered that earlier in saying that, it's based on your research and the people that you've talked to, it's best to try to keep older cars on the road, well maintained as long as possible. What else can we do?
So we need to start looking at certainly public transportation, improving public transportation. That's going to require changing our expectations. As long as we go for individually owned computers, individually owned vehicles, we're in that supply chain that's going to consume more and more. We also can redesign our cities so that they're more walkable. So say that you take public transportation into the city, if that's where you work or go to school,
Right.
and then you walk once you get off the train.
Right.
I'm also interested in looking, and here's a place where I don't know the answer. I'm in touch with people who are using landscape waste to generate biogas fuels, methane. In California, they're doing this for powering garbage trucks, for example. So landscape waste is freely available. You then need biodigesters, which, they cost money and energy and probably mining to manufacture them. But you can generate a renewable fuel. And those vehicles still have to be manufactured. Would that help? That's a question I've also got. But I think the bottom line is we really need to rethink our expectations of having an individually owned car, all those kinds of things. It's an incredible privilege to have a privately owned vehicle. It's an incredible privilege to have public transportation.
Yeah, I'm pausing because I don't want to say or assume that the American public would not go for that. I think I think there are subcultures or, subsects of the culture who would understand that and, make that transition for, that, or kind of make that sacrifice, if you will, for the betterment and of society and for the future. But I also think that, there are just as many people who would resist that, and say, well, that's, anti-American, or, maybe that's not the right way to phrase it, but
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And so it becomes a question, well, how, in the past, how did we change what happened that we changed our behavior? When have humans changed their
well,
behavior?
for the most part, we only do it unless we absolutely have to.
Right. There's a wonderful film, it's a documentary called The Power of Community. In Cuba in 1989, the whole country lost their oil supply overnight, literally overnight, when the Soviet Union broke up, the USSR. Mm-hmm. And Fidel Castro was pretty smart. So overnight, he said, okay, I'm going to go buy 3 million bicycles from China. And then he directed all of the scientists to focus on making biodynamic formulas for restoring nutrients to their soil. They tore up all the parking lots and made edible landscaping, and the farmers became the most respected, valuable members of the community. It took 3 years, and they went from having maybe a dozen monocrops to having an incredible array of nutrient-dense fruits and vegetables. And people really worked together. The pregnant women and people who were elderly or otherwise frail were given the best food available. Some people did go hungry, but they were working together. They would share their televisions. They did things and created community. They didn't have a choice.
Right.
And I think that's a fantastic model for what can happen when you don't have a choice. As long as somebody's got the money to do, to buy something and say, hey, I've got the money, I can do this, then again, the true costs are not visible. And
right. So let me just a little bit of pushback and say, or maybe that's not the right word, but a minute ago I said, there would be a lot of people who would resist, right? And when I think of the stereotype or the person or people that I would envision not going for that, the people that I said might say, oh, that's anti-American and, whatever. Those are the same people that are, going to call certain politicians communist. And, even as beautiful as your example was, I mean, that's a communist place, right? Fidel Castro and Cuba was communism. And, I think that plays right into the narrative of resistance from some of the people who would be resistant to these types of, whether it's self-sacrifice or, moving from individual vehicles to, shared communities and those types of things. I mean, how would you try to convey the importance of the situation to individuals that maybe think and live that way?
I would start with children. So if children can become aware, as you've just become aware, of what goes into manufacturing an electric vehicle, a hybrid vehicle, and a gas-guzzling vehicle, let them look at all of it. And then say that they research one substance that goes into a vehicle. and then share their research with their classmates, they're also going to take it home to their parents, and then they're going to say, wait a second, this is not, we can't, we might have the money for this, we might not, but if we're looking at what we really can afford as a society, this isn't it. So we want to start creating things that will allow us to live into old age, and we're going to need your help. So we need to start young, so that this that's one piece.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that this has to be. I mean, in our country, we tend to be, bipartisan. We tend to be binary in our thinking, and it's this side or that side. And, this, in order to get to a place where we're doing the right thing for our future, we're going to have to meet in the middle, and we're going to have to work on this, together. And, I'm trying to come up with solutions for how each side can, come together on common ground, right? And I think
the other thing that occurs to me as you're talking is, I can even hear it as you're talking now. It's the loss of this American dream. Mm-hmm. That look at how cool my car is. I mean, that's a big dream.
Right.
And so whenever we lose something like a big dream, there's a lot of grief and craziness in acknowledging that.
Well, I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's I've kind of been thinking about that, and in the back of my mind, that's something that I've been actually thinking about as we've been talking. So, last night, we're recording this on a Tuesday, and last night, I didn't know this, but it just so happened that last night Ford did the big reveal for their 2021 Bronco, the remake of the Ford Bronco. And I don't know, it got shared with me, and somebody shared with me a commercial that was incredibly compelling, and it had me thinking, like, man, I want one of those new Broncos. And as you've been talking today, and as we've been talking about, the solution is probably to not buy new vehicles, I'm like, man, I have to really think about what my priorities are, and what's important to me, what my values are. And it's a different way of thinking when it comes to cars, for sure.
To think about what your priorities are in terms of the earth and
am I gonna
and the children mining for the cobalt and coltan in Democratic Republic of Congo.
So I mean, we could talk about that stuff for a little bit longer, but I do want to ask you a couple other questions and kind of keep this to our about an hour, maybe a little bit longer. So two other things that we definitely want to touch on. One is we want to talk about the EMF exposure and Gary's concerns and experiences there. The other is we've kind of talked about cradle and usage part of the lifespan. We haven't talked about the grave. So real quick, I want to touch on the grave part and the disposal, especially things like batteries. And then as we talk about that, I'd also like to get your take on how the disposal portion of that lifespan for an electric vehicle compares to the disposal portion of the lifespan for a non-electric vehicle?
That's a good question. Let me say a couple things that I do know, and then there's a lot that I don't know there. Okay. So the battery it's a major part of an electric vehicle, and disposing of it is, it's going to be hazardous waste. It's probably going to be replaced during the vehicle's lifespan, usable lifespan, and then that battery will also need disposing. Annually, we we generate about, I think I'm reading now, 54 million metric tons of e-waste. And this amount is increasing by about 8 million tons every year.
What is e-waste?
Electronic waste.
Is that a tangible thing, or is that like dirty energy? What is that?
That's like when you throw away an electronic device because it's not working or the screen broke.
Okay. Gotcha.
And all the computers involved and batteries. Though that's all electronic waste.
Okay.
The waste streams from electric vehicle batteries is growing significantly. And then we can also talk about recycling. About 20% of electronics are currently recycled, which is obviously low. What's also not discussed is the energy that goes into recycling anything. That's tremendous. And there are also toxins emitted during that process. Now, say that you take apart a computer or a smartphone, you can mine the gold and the silver and the copper in it, and that's called urban mining, which is different from virgin mining. That process of recycling still consumes tremendous energy, still emits tremendous toxins in the process. So there are consequences all along. Now I'm going to go to your other question about electromagnetic radiation emissions. So within a car, a lot of these cars have sensors, and as we go into self-driving vehicles, where they will have sensors to see if there's somebody walking across the street and does the car need to stop, or if there's something else coming at the car. Those sensors are emitting frequencies, electromagnetic radiation. There's all the computers within the car. They have, there's a lot of electromagnetic radiation emitted during the car's operation. If we go back to Gary Olheft, my co-author, who has the deep brain stimulator for Parkinson's implanted in his brain, he knows people who've gotten into their hybrid vehicle after they had a deep brain stimulator implanted. And at every stoplight, when they were in their hybrid vehicle driving it, and the car braked, and when you brake a hybrid vehicle, the computer signaled the battery to recharge, right? The computer emits magnetic fields during that process. And the magnetic fields emitted by the computer shut off the woman's deep brain stimulator at every stoplight.
Jeez.
Now, that's a repeatable experience. It's not a woo-woo thing. It's like, there it was. It happened again.
Right.
That's pretty dangerous. In year 2000, NIH reported that 10% of the American population had some kind of medical implant,
Right.
like a cardiac pacemaker.
Well, that's exactly what I started thinking of, is like not just these things in your brain, but like what about pacemakers? What about people with
Right.
cardiac issues, right?
And insulin pumps and cochlear implants. I mean, there are lots of people now have some kind of medical implant. Gary has realized that the issue intensifies because now there's talk about putting induction chargers into roadways so that electric vehicles could charge while they drive. Right now, if you charge your vehicle, it can take, 7 or 8 hours to charge it, and then you might get 250 or 300 miles per charge. But if there were chargers built into roadways, well, then people could drive and get charged while they're driving. Okay, depending on what goes into those vehicles, into those chargers, depending on the power, frequency, and dosage,
Right.
the induction chargers could reprogram Gary's deep brain stimulator, and that could be fatal for him.
Right. And I mean, I tend to.
He wouldn't have to be in the car to experience that, by the way. He could just
be
a
on the
road.
sidewalk. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because you don't necessarily have to be in the vehicle. You're just in that magnetic field. And I keep thinking back to our first conversation, not on this podcast, but years ago, where you shared the information about the Telecommunications Act, where, and I think that was passed, I forget the year, 96?
1996,
Yeah, it was
Section
during
704, which states that no health or environmental concern can interfere with the placement of a cellular antenna.
Right. And so I can't help but think that same ethos would be in place here, where it's like, hey, progress won't be impeded by, concerns for ecosystems or human health.
Right. And this is interesting because his implant is, it's an electronic device. So we've actually got electronic interference between his device and an induction charger. So there are no humans involved. We can say it's one device to another that we're saying generates interference. And you might find an agency that would support a lawsuit saying, no, you've got interference going. If you went to at it from the human perspective, with our current thinking and our current legislation, you're not going to get support.
Right. And that's what I'm struggling with, is like, how crazy and perverse is that?
It's pretty crazy.
That if you argued in his defense on the human health side of it, even in the highest courts, they wouldn't hear it, and they would side with that. What was it? 704, whatever code you just stated.
The Telecom Act.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet, if, as you just said, you went from electric to electric and you took the human part out of it, then you might actually have a winnable argument. Like that, to me, that is just crazy.
And I'm going to say that's where our thinking, we need to re-examine our thinking and our priorities. And that's why we're going to have to start with children, because when we get to be your age and my age, our thinking, we've just assumed that electronics rule. And the profit rules.
Right. Well, Katie, I think this is a good place to end this one and wrap it up for today. I think for me, the thing that I keep coming back to, in looking at your work and the conversations we have is, I love that you used the words earlier, awareness and choice. And to me, the awareness is, looking for the true cost of things, the embodied energy and the full life cycle. On the last show, we asked you our closing question. So today, for something a little bit different, I'll just turn it over to you and just ask if there are any closing statements that you'd like to add, or any suggestions on what we can do in our efforts to be better humans.
Wow. I'll say I salute you, Ryan Munsey, because you're really, like I can see, you're really wrestling, including just in the last 24 hours, you were lusting for that new Ford Bronco. And now you're saying, oh my God, what am I wanting? That's a really cool place to notice yourself and the ramifications. I mean, I'm just gonna say, I just appreciate so much that you're going to that space yourself, and yeah, that you're going to even have me on again so we can talk about this in relation to renewable power. It's another not easy subject. I think that's what we need, is just to keep talking about this and to find openings where we can say, hey, you know what? I didn't buy this, and I've got really satisfying conversations between my ears and among my friends. And sometimes people are walking away from me, but then maybe they're walking back or whatever. I mean, I've certainly had dear friends say, Katie, I can't hear this. And I have to give them space for that.
Yeah.
We're all in this mess. We're all contributing to it. And we have to be gentle with ourselves, and we have to acknowledge we cannot continue this level of consumption.
That's a really important statement, that we're all in this mess together. We're all contributing to it. We have to be gentle. I mean, that's really powerful and important. It's much better than what I was thinking. I was thinking that instead of buying that new Bronco, I was going to buy like a 1980 something Toyota that still runs, and spray paint on the side, 0 kids buried in a conflict mine, and park next to that person you saw with the 0 emissions on their electric vehicle.
Let me add something to it, which is, if you buy that 1980 vehicle, you're going to need a really good mechanic.
And that's why I don't do it, because I'm not a good mechanic, and I don't want to have to deal with that all the time.
Okay, but so then there you go. That's a challenge that we need. We need really good young mechanics. Every neighborhood needs good mechanics. Yeah. And that's another thing we can develop. And so there have to be older mechanics still alive who could teach younger mechanics. That would be great. That would be really good. These new vehicles, I mean, forget it. There's so many computers on them. People say all the time, it just wasn't worth it to repair it, so I bought a new car.
Yeah.
We need more mechanics. That's an American dream.
Yeah. There's so many layers to this stuff. Katie, thank you so much for your time and the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate that a lot.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hope you enjoyed the show for today. Katie has kind of a standing offer to come back on the show from me, and I want to let you guys know that we have a standing offer to fire away and pepper her with questions. So if there's anything you want to know about electric vehicles, renewables, solar panels, internet, computers, technology, 5G, any of that stuff, send me your questions for Katie. I will pass them along to her, or bring her back on, and maybe we'll just do a full Q&A with her, whatever that is. So any questions, any disagreements, any thoughts, comments, concerns, anything, send them our way. We will address those. And as always, thank you for being a part of the Better Human Project, and thank you for trusting us to be a part of your journey.